the spring of 1940, Paris bloomed in quiet defiance of what loomed just across the Rhine. The cafes were still open. Children still played along the Seine. And the French government, proud, scarred, and deeply cautious, after the horrors of World War I, insisted that this time, things would be different. France was prepared, or so it thought. On paper, France was still a great power, a nation of almost 40 million, with one of the largest armies in Europe, a formidable navy, and a defensive line of fortresses so advanced, military theorists hailed it as unbreakable. The scars of 1914, 1918 had reshaped France into a fortress mindset. Never again would German troops march unchallenged across French soil. But beneath the surface, all was not well. The Third Republic, by 1940, was politically fractured and socially weary. A decade of revolving-door governments had left leadership indecisive. Veterans of the First World War dominated the ranks of generals and planners, men who understood trenches and attrition, but not speed, coordination, or air power. The trauma of Verdun and the Marne had produced a military culture obsessed with defense and terrified of another bloodbath, so they poured their hopes into concrete. The Maginot Line, a vast series of bunkers, tunnels, artillery positions, and observation posts stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg, stood as a monument to this thinking. Armed with retractable turrets, air-conditioned quarters, and interlocking fields of fire, it was meant to deter any future invasion. But it came with a fatal flaw. It didn't extend far enough. In an effort to preserve Belgian neutrality and perhaps more truthfully, because of budget constraints and political hesitation, the Maginot Line stopped short of the Ardennes forest. French planners considered the region impassable to tanks. It was dense, mountainous, and threaded with narrow roads. A perfect natural defense. Or so they believed. Meanwhile, Germany under Hitler's newly rebuilt Wehrmacht was studying that very blind spot. But in early May 1940, few in France imagined that the war would truly come to them. The so-called phony war had dragged on since September 1939. After Germany invaded Poland and France declared war in response, little had happened on the Western Front. The French dug in. The British sent an expeditionary force. Patrols skirmished along the Siegfried Line. But for 8 months, it was mostly silence. This calm, however, was deceptive and deeply dangerous. Within the ranks of the French military, confidence began to border on complacency. Their intelligence services had tracked German movements, but the belief held firm. The main thrust would come through Belgium, just like in 1914. So French forces massed along the Belgian border, waiting for a repeat of the last war. They would not get it. Inside the general staff in Paris, debate simmered, but never boiled. Some junior officers warned about German armored mobility. A few suggested more reconnaissance near the Ardennes. Others proposed more coordination with the British. But time after time, decisions defaulted to inertia. France was not preparing for this war. It was still bracing for the last one. And the people? They wanted peace. The trauma of the Great War still hung over French society like smoke. Nearly every family had lost someone. Whole villages remained half empty. A new war felt not only terrifying, but pointless. While Britain still carried a sense of imperial destiny, France, still recovering economically and spiritually, was split between pacifism, cynicism, and fear. So when the German Blitzkrieg finally exploded across the Meuse on May 10, 1940, it didn't just break the lines. It broke the illusion. France was not ready. Not militarily, not politically, not psychologically. But by the time anyone truly realized it, German tanks were already roaring through the Ardennes, and the 6-week clock to collapse had begun ticking. The Maginot Line was France's answer to the ghosts of 1914. Running along the German border from Switzerland to Luxembourg, it was a marvel of interwar engineering, fortified underground cities with gun turrets, train lines, air filtration systems, and reinforced bunkers deep in the hills. It represented everything the French High Command valued after the First World War: caution, permanence, and a belief that war could be delayed, if not prevented, by preparation alone. But as history would prove, you can't win tomorrow's war with yesterday's fears. The Maginot Line wasn't just a structure, it was a mindset, a symbol of defensive certainty in an uncertain time. French leaders believed that with Germany blocked to the east, any attack would have to go through Belgium, just like in World War I. That meant French forces could choose where to meet the enemy. They didn't need to be fast, only ready. So they anchored their entire military doctrine around the line. But even at its most impressive, the Maginot Line had gaps, and not just in its concrete. To the north, where it met the border with Belgium, the line ended. It didn't continue into Belgian territory because of diplomacy. France didn't want to appear aggressive toward its neutral neighbor by fortifying the shared frontier. And so, the Ardennes forest, dense, rocky, and largely undeveloped, was left open. French generals deemed it unsuitable for tanks. Their calculations weren't entirely foolish. The roads were narrow, the terrain steep, and supply lines difficult to maintain. But it was a gamble, and Germany called the bluff. In secret, German strategists had been studying this blind spot since the fall of Poland. General Erich von Manstein proposed a bold alternative to the predictable Schlieffen-style attack. Instead of punching through Belgium head-on, why not send armored divisions through the Ardennes, right where the French least expected? The plan was risky, but Hitler approved it. Meanwhile, French defenses remained static. Military exercises were minimal. Air reconnaissance over the Ardennes was limited. Even when scout planes returned with images of German convoys moving into Luxembourg, the reports were largely dismissed. High command insisted the buildup was a feint. Because if it wasn't, if the Germans really were sending armor through the Ardennes, then the entire French plan collapsed. At the operational level, the Maginot Line created a false sense of security. It anchored troops to positions that couldn't maneuver. French doctrine didn't emphasize mobile reserves or armored counterattacks. Instead, they relied on fixed infantry divisions holding ground. But Blitzkrieg, by its very nature, shattered such assumptions. Germany wasn't trying to grind forward like in the trenches of 1916. They were trying to break through, encircle, and paralyze fast. And while the Maginot Line held firm where it was manned, it quickly became irrelevant. German forces didn't even need to attack it directly. They simply bypassed it, using the very hole that French planners refused to believe was vulnerable. To make matters worse, once the Germans broke into France through the Ardennes, they moved faster than anything the French had ever trained for. Communication lines broke down. Orders couldn't keep up. Entire divisions found themselves outflanked, surrounded, or retreating without ever seeing the enemy face to face. And through it all, the Maginot Line sat silent, untouched, intact, and irrelevant. It hadn't been breached. It had simply been avoided. By late May, German tanks had already reached the English Channel. The main French forces were cut off in Belgium, and the line, the one thing French generals had bet the nation's safety on, was now behind enemy lines, facing the wrong way. The myth of invincibility that the Maginot Line projected became one of the greatest psychological weaknesses of the French war effort. It lulled both leaders and citizens into believing that another German invasion could be managed with patience and concrete. But Hitler wasn't building a rerun of 1914. He was writing a new script, and the French never turned the page. In the end, the Maginot Line was not defeated by German firepower. It was defeated by German imagination. If the Maginot Line was France's fortress, then the Ardennes was its blind spot, not because they ignored it, but because they trusted it. Trusted that nature would do what concrete could not. Trusted that thick forest and steep ridges would stop any enemy columns in their tracks. But in May 1940, the Germans didn't stop. They went through. The Ardennes forest stretches across Luxembourg, Belgium, and northeast France, a rugged, hilly region of dense trees, narrow roads, and limited infrastructure. For decades, French military planners labeled it unfit for mechanized warfare, a natural barrier. It became the perfect route precisely because no one expected it. Behind the scenes, German high command had approved a daring plan from General Erich von Manstein. Instead of following the expected path through Flanders, where most French and British forces waited, he proposed a rapid armored thrust through the Ardennes. Once past the Meuse River, the Germans would drive west to the Channel, cutting off the Allied armies from Paris. It was a high-risk, high-reward maneuver, and the Wehrmacht committed to it fully. On the 10th of May 1940, the plan went into motion. Panzer divisions, supported by engineers, motorized infantry, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance units, poured into Luxembourg and southern Belgium. In less than 3 days, German tanks were rumbling through the so-called impenetrable forest at a pace that stunned even their own commanders. The roads were tight. The columns stretched for miles. One well-placed airstrike or artillery barrage could have caused chaos. But the French response? Almost nothing. Why? Because French intelligence didn't believe what it was seeing. Reconnaissance planes had spotted convoys and bridge-building teams. Warnings were relayed. But the High Command, clinging to its outdated assumptions, dismissed the activity as a diversion. The real attack, they insisted, was coming through central Belgium, so French reserves stayed in place, and the Germans kept advancing. By May 12, the spearheads reached the River Meuse near Sedan. This wasn't just a symbolic target, it was the gateway into the French heartland. Defenses here were thin, held mostly by second-line troops, many of them older reservists or poorly equipped formations. They'd been told the terrain would protect them. It didn't. On May 13, after a blistering Luftwaffe bombing campaign that devastated French morale and communications, German engineers built makeshift bridges under fire. By evening, panzer units had crossed the Meuse. The impossible had happened. Armored forces had broken through the Ardennes in just 72 hours. What followed was what historians call the sickle cut. Once across the Meuse, German tanks didn't turn toward Paris, not yet. They turned northwest, slicing across France toward the English Channel. The goal was simple: trap the bulk of the Allied armies, including the British Expeditionary Force, in a pocket near the Belgian border. It worked better than anyone in Berlin had dared to hope. The French command was paralyzed. Their communications had not kept pace with events. Orders were outdated the moment they were issued. And worst of all, they had no strategic reserves positioned to block the corridor forming behind their front lines. One French officer would later describe the feeling as trying to stop a tidal wave with a broom. And yet, it wasn't raw firepower that made the Ardennes gamble so devastating. It was speed, shock, surprise. The Germans hadn't just outgunned the French, they had outthought them. They'd studied French doctrine, they'd identified the blind spot, and they'd bet the entire campaign on a forest that French generals thought couldn't be crossed. By the end of the first week, the French front was no longer a line, it was a collapsing spiral. And in the center of that spiral, a gamble that paid off beyond even Hitler's expectations. By mid-May 1940, the German war machine was no longer advancing through France, it was tearing through it. What began as a calculated push through the Ardennes had exploded into a full-blown rout. The word Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was no longer theory. It was reality. And the French army, once considered the most powerful in Europe, was unraveling under its speed and precision. But what was Blitzkrieg really? Contrary to popular myth, Blitzkrieg wasn't a formal doctrine in German military manuals. It was an operational method: shock, speed, and coordination. Instead of grinding warfare, as in 1914-18, it combined air power, fast-moving tanks, mobile infantry, and psychological collapse, all working in tandem to paralyze the enemy before it could respond. And in France, it worked almost perfectly. Take, for example, the Battle of Sedan, where General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions burst through the Meuse on May 13. Once across, Guderian didn't wait for infantry to secure the flanks, he pushed forward, driving west at breakneck speed. His orders were clear: keep moving, exploit confusion, and don't let the French recover. It was not just about firepower, it was tempo. The Germans moved faster than French maps could track. By May 15, French generals were reporting that there is no longer any front. Their lines had not been broken, they had been bypassed. Entire units still facing Belgium realized they were surrounded from behind. It wasn't just military defeat, it was cognitive overload. The French command structure, designed for methodical war, simply couldn't adapt. In Paris, General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, was stunned. His plans had assumed days, maybe weeks, of warning. But the German tanks had already moved over 60 miles in just 5 days. There were no clear reports, no time to reorganize. When asked where the main German thrust was headed, Gamelin replied, "I have no idea." That admission said it all. Meanwhile, the French armored response was too little, too late. While the Germans concentrated their tanks into tight, fast-moving spearheads, French armor was scattered in small units across the front. Even when French tanks such as the Char B-1 and Somme S-35 outgunned their German counterparts, they lacked radio communication, air cover, and most fatally, a coherent strategy. At Hanot and Gembloux, French tank crews fought bravely and sometimes even won tactical engagements. But they couldn't stop the tide. German aircraft, especially the feared Stuka dive bombers, crippled bridges, supply lines, and morale. Rear echelons collapsed under bombardment before frontline troops even saw a German helmet. And then came the worst blow of all. The sickle cut closed. By May 20, German panzer columns reached the English Channel near Abbeville, effectively splitting the Allied forces in two. Over 1 million French, Belgian, and British troops, including the entire British Expeditionary Force, were now trapped in a pocket stretching from Lille to Dunkirk. It was a military disaster on a scale no one had predicted. French command tried to organize counterattacks to cut the German corridor, but the effort was disjointed. General de Gaulle, then, a little-known brigadier, led one of the few counterattacks at Montcornet on May 17. His tanks made local gains, but were forced to retreat under withering air assault. There was simply no coordination, no support, and no follow-through. Blitzkrieg didn't just destroy enemy formations. It dismantled decision-making. French orders took hours to reach the front. German orders took minutes. French officers needed phones, couriers, and field headquarters. German panzer commanders used radios mounted in every tank. In a war of speed, France was fighting in slow motion. And while the French government debated its next move, the German war machine didn't pause. Civilians flooded the roads in what would become the largest refugee crisis in Western Europe since the Middle Ages, over 8 million people fleeing south. The Wehrmacht barely had to fire in some towns. The panic was doing the work for them. It was not just a collapse of strategy. It was the collapse of will. France still had soldiers, still had tanks, still had defenses south of the Somme. But the shock of Blitzkrieg, its psychological disruption, had already fractured the backbone of French resistance. And the Germans knew it. Sedan was more than a city. It was a symbol, and within 3 days it became the fracture point that shattered the spine of French defense. In the French military's pre-war doctrine, Sedan was supposed to be secure. Located on the Meuse River, backed by hilly terrain and the edge of the Ardennes, it was held by second-line troops, older reservists, lightly equipped, stationed in static positions. The high command in Paris believed it was safe, even boring. The real fighting, they said, would come farther north, in Belgium. They were wrong. On the 12th of May 1940, General Heinz Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps reached the outskirts of Sedan. His orders were simple and terrifying: cross the Meuse and punch a hole into France's interior. If successful, the German armor would bypass the strongest parts of the French front and open the path to the Channel. The French commanders were confident. The terrain would slow the Germans. The Ardennes had done its job, or so they thought. But Guderian had other plans. He didn't wait for the traditional artillery bombardment or weeks of siege. Instead, on May 13, he unleashed the Luftwaffe. Stuka dive bombers, flying in screaming waves, attacked French positions with surgical ferocity. Ammunition dumps, trenches, bunkers, and communication posts were smashed within hours. French soldiers, mostly from the 55th Infantry Division, had no real air defense, no fighter support, no cover from above. They crumbled. The psychological effect of the air assault cannot be overstated. French officers described the bombardment as paralyzing. Radio posts went silent. Orders stopped. Some units simply abandoned their positions without firing a shot. It wasn't cowardice, it was shock. This wasn't war as they knew it. This was mechanized terror, delivered from the sky. By the end of the day, German engineers were building pontoon bridges under fire. French artillery tried to respond, but their positions had already been devastated. Spotters were dead or missing. Commanders had no visibility. And the Germans? They just kept coming. By the evening of May 13, German infantry had crossed the Meuse. The next morning, the tanks followed. This wasn't supposed to be possible. French doctrine said it would take days, maybe even a week, to build bridgeheads under fire. The Germans did it in less than 36 hours. What happened next was even worse. Instead of waiting for infantry support or orders from Berlin, Guderian pushed forward on his own initiative. His panzer divisions began pouring into the French rear, exploiting the psychological collapse that Sedan had triggered. Entire sectors lost cohesion. French divisions north of the Meuse, still preparing for battle in Belgium, suddenly found themselves encircled from behind. Command posts couldn't reach units. Reserve forces had no time to organize, and still, Paris clung to the belief that the Ardennes was impassable in force. Now, German tanks were accelerating through it. What made the fall of Sedan so devastating was not just the loss of the city. It was what it represented. It proved that Blitzkrieg wasn't a stunt, it was a system. It showed that German air power, armor, and initiative could dismantle a prepared defense in days, not weeks. It also exposed France's most fatal flaw: strategic rigidity. Where the Germans moved with daring and speed, French high command hesitated. They argued over orders. Some refused to believe the reports coming from the Meuse. Even when Guderian's tanks were dozens of kilometers beyond Sedan, the official maps in Paris still showed the Germans pinned at the river. And by the time reality set in, it was too late. The breach at Sedan was no longer a gap. It was a funnel, and the entire Wehrmacht was pouring through it. In just 3 days, one overlooked sector had become the turning point of the campaign. And from this breach, the fate of France would be sealed not in months, but in weeks. After the breakthrough at Sedan, what followed wasn't a battle, it was a race to the sea. And Germany won it in 10 days. By the 20th of May, 1940, just 10 days after launching their invasion, German panzer divisions had reached the English Channel near Abbeville. That meant one thing. The entire Allied force in Belgium, French, First Army, Belgian Army, and the British Expeditionary Force was trapped. This moment marked the true turning point of the campaign. France wasn't just losing ground, it was losing the war. But how did this encirclement happen so quickly? Let's break it down. After Guderian's tanks broke through at Sedan, they didn't stop to consolidate or wait for infantry. They pushed west fast. By May 15, they were at Rethel. By May 17, at Montcornet. By May 19, they were rolling through Amiens. And by the next day, they hit water. This kind of momentum was unheard of. French planners were still operating under the logic of World War I. Battles took weeks. Fronts moved slowly. Cavalry was outdated, but the mindset remained. A war of attrition, not motion. But this wasn't attrition. It was penetration, deep, fast, and terrifying. The French had no mobile reserves to plug the gap. Worse, their command structure was paralyzed. Reports were late, outdated, or outright ignored. General Gamelin, still believing the main German thrust was in Belgium, hesitated to redirect forces south. That hesitation doomed the Allies in the north. Let's talk about the sickle cut, the term historians use for the German maneuver through the Ardennes, then northwest to the Channel. Think of it like a blade swinging behind enemy lines. It didn't just pierce it encircled, and once that blade reached the sea, the trap was shut. Now imagine being a soldier in the Allied Northern Front, French, Belgian, or British. One day, you're advancing into Belgium expecting to meet the Germans head-on. The next, you're hearing rumors that enemy tanks are behind you. Then you see refugees fleeing in the opposite direction. Then your supply lines vanish. Ammunition runs low. Fuel stops coming. And suddenly, you realize you're surrounded. The psychological blow was enormous. British commanders began planning evacuation scenarios by May 21. They saw the writing on the wall, and to their credit, so did some French generals. But even then, there was no consensus. The French government still hoped to mount a counterattack to cut the German corridor in half. Enter General Charles de Gaulle. At this time, de Gaulle was barely known. A brigadier general with bold ideas, he launched a counteroffensive at Montcornet with a small armored division. His tanks managed to punch into German lines, destroy dozens of vehicles, and briefly retake ground. But it wasn't enough. No reinforcements, no coordination, no air cover. It was a spark of resistance, but the fire had already gone out. Meanwhile, the Germans weren't just using tanks, they used psychological warfare too. Leaflets rained from the sky over Allied positions. You are surrounded, you have no hope, surrender and live. Many believed them. Entire French units surrendered without a fight. British and Belgian troops dug in, preparing for the worst. And behind them, Hitler's generals debated their next move. Some, like Guderian, wanted to finish the job and crush the pocket. Others, including Hitler himself, hesitated. They feared the terrain around the northern coast might bog down the tanks. So, they paused for just 48 hours. That pause gave the Allies their sliver of hope. And out of that sliver came the desperate plan at Dunkirk, a story for another section. But the damage was done. From May 10 to May 20, Germany had advanced over 200 miles. They had split the Allied armies in two. And most importantly, they had shattered the French strategic position. There would still be battles ahead. But France, as a cohesive fighting force, had already lost the war. By late May 1940, over 400,000 Allied troops were trapped, pressed against the northern coast of France, with the sea behind them and the German army closing in. The soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and remnants of Belgian units faced a grim choice: surrender or escape across the Channel. This wasn't part of any Allied plan. Dunkirk wasn't a staging ground, it was supposed to be a supply route. But now, it became the last exit. And what followed would go down in history as either a miracle of deliverance or a sign of just how catastrophically the French defense had failed. Let's rewind a few days. After the Germans completed the sickle cut and reached the Channel on May 20, they'd effectively trapped the entire Allied northern group. French high command was in chaos. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill described it as the greatest military defeat of modern times in strategic terms. But something odd happened. Instead of pressing the advantage immediately, German tank divisions halted. Hitler and his high command, fearing that the terrain near Dunkirk would bog down their panzers, ordered a pause. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, insisted that his bombers could finish the job. This decision, one of the most debated in military history, bought the Allies 48 critical hours, and the British seized it. On May 26, Operation Dynamo was launched. Naval officers, civilian volunteers, and every seaworthy vessel available were mobilized from ports along the southern English coast. Tugboats, fishing trawlers, yachts, even paddle steamers crossed the Channel under air attack and artillery fire. Their goal: evacuate as many soldiers as possible from Dunkirk's beaches. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Over the next 9 days, more than 338,000 troops were rescued from the beaches and mole at Dunkirk. 198,000 British and 140,000 French. It was, logistically speaking, a stunning achievement. But make no mistake, it was not a victory. The British Army left behind nearly all of its heavy weapons: 2,400 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, 70,000 tons of ammunition, and 500,000 tons of supplies. France had sacrificed its best divisions in Belgium. And now, with those troops either trapped, captured, or evacuated, the interior of France stood exposed. French commanders, politicians, and civilians watched in shock as the evacuation unfolded. On one hand, it showed Allied solidarity. On the other, it felt like abandonment. France had defended British soil in 1914. Now, as German troops advanced toward Paris, Britain was pulling out. The French press at the time called it a magnificent retreat. But behind the headlines, the mood was somber. Morale plummeted. Civilians streamed south in even greater numbers, nearly 8 million refugees by early June. Roads were clogged, trains overloaded, cities emptied. And for the French military, Dunkirk meant starting over without equipment, without a plan, and increasingly without hope. But here's the key point. Dunkirk didn't lose France, the war. France had already lost strategically at Sedan, and then again during the race to the sea. Dunkirk was just the final act of that collapse. It did, however, save Britain. Without those 198,000 men returning home, the United Kingdom would have had no credible army to resist a German invasion. The preservation of the BEF made the defense of Britain possible, and in time the liberation of Europe. So, was Dunkirk a miracle? Perhaps. But it was a miracle born of desperation, not brilliance. And for France, it was a wake-up call too late to answer. The German armies had paused, but only briefly. As soon as the evacuation ended, they turned south toward Paris. And what followed would be the final unraveling of the French Third Republic. Paris had been here before the drums of war, the distant thunder of guns, the looming dread of occupation. But nothing in 1940 resembled 1914. There would be no miracle on the Marne, no drawn-out trench warfare. This time, the German army was coming fast, and there would be no stopping it. By early June, France was disintegrating militarily, politically, and emotionally. The Maginot Line was irrelevant. The best French divisions had been gutted in Belgium. The British had pulled out from Dunkirk, and the remaining French forces, stretched thin across a rapidly crumbling front, no longer believed they could win. On June 5, Germany launched Fall Rot, the second phase of its invasion. Unlike the first, this wasn't about clever encirclement or surprise. It was a frontal assault across the Somme and Aisne rivers, and the French were in no condition to resist. By now, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies. The French Air Force had been depleted in the initial weeks. Communications were erratic, infantry reserves were exhausted, and new recruits were rushed to the front with almost no training. The German advance became unstoppable, not just because of strength, but because of the collapse of French command and cohesion. Civilians felt it too. Paris, one of the cultural capitals of the world, turned into a ghost city almost overnight. As the Wehrmacht advanced, millions of Parisians fled south in a chaotic exodus. Entire families piled into carts, bicycles, and whatever vehicles remained. They dragged mattresses, pots, children, and panic down the roads, clogging every route out of the capital. French leadership fractured under the pressure. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud desperately tried to hold the government together. He pleaded with Britain for reinforcements, asked for a joint last stand, and even considered forming a Franco-British union. But time was up, and so was patience. Enter Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old World War I hero. In mid-June, as German troops approached Paris, political factions in the French cabinet rallied around Pétain not for victory, but for surrender. To them, fighting on meant the total destruction of France. They remembered Verdun, not as glory, but as horror. Pétain's message was clear. We must cease fighting. And so, Paris was abandoned. On the 10th of June 1940, the French government fled the capital and declared it an open city undefended and unfortified, to spare it from destruction. No shots were fired. No barricades were built. The German army rolled in on June 14, marching in formation down the Champs-Élysées. It was the third time in 70 years that German troops had occupied Paris. But this time felt different. In 1871, during the Franco-Prussian War, Paris resisted for months. In 1914, the city prepared for siege but was saved. In 1940, it folded in 4 days. The fall of Paris wasn't just military, it was psychological. A cultural beacon, the symbol of French identity, was taken with barely a struggle. The French public watched in stunned silence. Radio broadcasts went dark. Newspapers printed German communiques, and for many, hope vanished with the sight of swastikas flying over the Eiffel Tower. This collapse of morale had ripple effects. In the south, panic deepened. Refugee columns grew longer. Towns turned away their own citizens, fearing food shortages and German reprisals. French soldiers deserted in the thousands. Resistance, for most, felt futile. Churchill offered to send a token British force to defend the capital not because he believed it would succeed, but because he understood symbolism. France declined. The political center had shifted decisively from resistance to capitulation. And so, with Paris lost, the next debate wasn't about how to win, but how to surrender. On June 17, 1940, Marshal Philippe Pétain addressed the French people in a solemn radio broadcast. "My heart breaks to say it," he began. "But we must stop the fighting." He called for an armistice, asking the enemy Nazi Germany for terms of surrender. Just 6 weeks earlier, France had mobilized millions, boasting one of the largest armies in Europe. Now, that same nation was begging for peace not because it lacked weapons, but because it had lost the will to fight. This wasn't just a military decision, it was a political and moral collapse. Let's break down how France, once the fiercest opponent of German aggression, ended up signing one of the most humiliating agreements in modern history. By the time Pétain took control, the government had fractured. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who still believed France could fight on from the colonies, had resigned under pressure. President Albert Lebrun, feeling powerless, stepped back. And with Paris gone and most of the army in disarray, Pétain's camp won out with one central argument: better defeat than destruction. But not everyone agreed. General Charles de Gaulle, recently appointed Undersecretary for War, fled to London and delivered a fiery radio speech on June 18. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. It was a bold, lonely stand, and at the time few were listening. Most French citizens, exhausted and disillusioned, weren't ready to think about future resistance. They were just trying to survive. So on June 22, a delegation of French officers traveled to the forest of Compiègne, the very site where, 22 years earlier, Germany had signed its own humiliating surrender to France in 1918. Now, Hitler wanted revenge. The symbolism was brutal. He demanded that the French delegation sign the armistice in the same railway carriage used by the Germans in World War I. He even sat in the same seat Marshal Foch had used. But unlike in 1918, there would be no negotiation. The terms were harsh, not total occupation, but enough to break France's military, economy, and sovereignty. 2/3 of the country would be occupied by German forces. The French army would be disarmed. The French navy would be interned, but not surrendered, a concession Hitler made reluctantly. A new regime, headquartered in the town of Vichy, would administer the unoccupied zone under German supervision. France would keep a government, but it would no longer be free. More painful still, the armistice didn't even guarantee peace. The war continued, but France was now out of it, effectively neutralized and subordinate. And so, at 6:50 p.m., on the 22nd of June 1940, the French delegation signed the armistice. France, the great republic, the victor of World War I, the nation that once drew the line against fascism, had fallen without a full national defense. The psychological impact was enormous. To Hitler, it was a triumph not just of arms, but of ideology. His enemies were divided. France, the symbol of liberal democracy and cultural sophistication, had surrendered in record time. His generals were stunned. His people celebrated. And for France, it entered a dark new era, one of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and reckoning. Pétain and the Vichy regime would go on to cooperate with the Nazis, sometimes willingly, sometimes under duress, sending French Jews to death camps, suppressing resistance, and dismantling the Republic from within. What made the armistice so tragic wasn't just the military terms. It was the moral surrender, the idea that France had given up on itself. The country that once shouted, "Liberté, égalité, fraternité," now watched swastikas fly over its government buildings. But in London, de Gaulle and the Free French were just getting started. The 25th of June, 1940. The guns fell silent in France. The armistice with Germany had come into effect. A proud nation, the birthplace of revolutions, enlightenment, and European power politics had collapsed in just 43 days. But long after the tanks stopped rolling and the cities fell quiet, the shockwaves of France's rapid defeat would ripple through Europe and history. How could one of the world's most powerful militaries crumble so quickly? Was it bad luck? Flawed strategy? Political cowardice? Or something deeper? Let's look at the legacy and the lessons of those 6 brutal weeks. The myth of French weakness. In the years that followed, especially after World War II, a damaging myth took hold, that France lost because its soldiers didn't fight. That narrative was wrong and unfair. In truth, French troops fought valiantly in many places. At Ston, where a single village changed hands 17 times in 3 days. At Dunkirk, where French units held the perimeter to buy time for Allied evacuations. Along the Maginot Line, which never fell in direct assault. France's fall wasn't due to cowardice. It was a failure of leadership, doctrine, and adaptation. The cost of fighting the last war. Perhaps the clearest lesson of 1940 is the danger of preparing for the previous war. French strategy in the interwar years had been entirely shaped by the trauma of World War I. The Maginot Line was meant to prevent another bloody trench conflict. French generals focused on static defense, believing that mobility and air power were secondary. But Germany had rewritten the playbook. Blitzkrieg wasn't just speed, it was operational shock. Tanks, planes, radio coordination, and psychological disruption. France had the tanks, it had the men, but it lacked the doctrinal vision and the agility to respond in time. Political paralysis and fear of revolution. Internally, France was divided and fragile. The 1930 seconds had been a time of economic crisis, bitter class struggle, and the rise of both fascist and communist movements. French leaders feared another civil war as much as they feared Germany. That fear paralyzed decision-making and undermined public confidence. When the Germans advanced, much of the elite, political, military, and business saw surrender as preferable to chaos. In that sense, France in 1940 didn't just face an external enemy. It was also fighting its own unresolved demons. The price of underestimating the enemy. From the top down, French planners assumed that any German invasion would resemble 1914 slow, clumsy, predictable. They dismissed the Ardennes as impassable for armor. They expected Hitler's main thrust to come through Belgium, and they thought the Maginot Line would buy them months. They were wrong on every count. That underestimation, rooted in cultural arrogance and outdated intelligence, proved fatal. A nation's psychological collapse. Ultimately, France didn't lose the war, only on the battlefield. It lost it in its heart and mind. When Paris fell without resistance, when millions of civilians fled south in panic, when the government chose collaboration over exile, France suffered a crisis of identity. For decades after the war, the memory of 1940 would haunt its politics. The fall of France became a national trauma, one that shaped everything from de Gaulle's defiance to the later obsession with nuclear independence and European unity. So why does it still matter today? Because 1940 wasn't just a French failure, it was a European one. It showed what happens when democracies become complacent, when old doctrines go unquestioned, when the fear of chaos outweighs the will to resist. And because, even now, the story of France's collapse reminds us that power, wealth, and history guarantee nothing unless a nation is ready to adapt, unify, and act with courage. In 1940, France had the tools to fight. What it lacked was the belief that it still could.